Trigger warning, if you're autistic and you've either been abused by a narcissistic person or accused of being one, this video might be difficult for you. I've recently noticed that in the autistic community, when we hear any idea that remotely suggests that an autistic person could be narcissistic or that a narcissistic person could be autistic, there's a mass surge of righteous indignation to beat it to death with a stick before it breeds. Granted, it makes perfect sense that we would feel this way. Many of us, myself included, have not only been treated like we're narcissists, but we've also experienced the horror of recognizing the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder in ourselves. After all, we might also struggle to receive someone else's subjective experience, have exaggerated fears of being rejected or mocked, view minor disagreements as potential dangers, lean into all or nothing thinking, have a hard time working in a group, tend to bring the topic of conversation back to our own interests, and most chillingly, experience perfectionism and a need for control. This is why many of us at one point or another were genuinely concerned we had NPD. But I'm going to go light with the terms NPD, narcissist, or narcissistic personality disorder, because I think it's crucial we focus on the problematic behavior instead. Labeling someone with these terms can be harmful because it triggers emotional distress that interferes with recognizing and addressing behavior. An example of aforementioned harm is the emergence of this baseless dichotomy between narcissism and autism, because it is entirely possible to have both. Because guess what generally causes narcissism? Trauma. And guess what autistic people have a shit ton of? Trauma. Behavior associated with narcissism, including manipulative behavior, can be a trauma response to growing up in an holistic world with autism. I totally get why suggesting autistic people could be manipulative might make people want to throw chairs at their screen, but I'm operating from the Cambridge Dictionary definition: controlling someone or something to your own advantage, often unfairly or dishonestly. I am not going to deny that being dishonest causes extreme psychological distress in the autistic mind. However, if we have to survive, we cope with that distress by lying to ourselves. A commonly understood example of this is masking. Masking is presenting ourselves inauthentically in order to take control of the way others respond to us, unfairly taking away their right to make their own decisions about how to respond to who we actually are. I assure you this is not a judgment of autism or autistic people, because it's not in our best interest to trust people to exercise that right until the bulk of society is educated about autistic needs and their validity. It endangers us to do so. Self-defense. In the same vein, there are certain traumatized autistic people who have learned that the only way to protect their safety is to play a zero-sum game with their needs and the needs of others. They have learned if they respect other people's boundaries, they will be harmed. So here's a breakdown of how this happens. Trauma, across all neurotypes, often stems from emotional neglect in our youth. We can think of this as love starvation. And because humanity is a social species, love is a basic need. And if our basic needs were neglected, it can evoke a strong sense that we now deserve better treatment, and reasonably so. It can also ignite a belief that we are owed. This can collide in dangerous ways with some realities of the autistic brain. We have a strong sense of justice and fairness and a very literal, rigid, and rule-bound way of thinking. So if we feel adamantly that we are owed, we may feel it with uncompromising inflexibility. We're also more likely to require a feeling of preparedness and control to emotionally regulate and properly engage our executive functioning, both of which are fundamental to our ability to reason and make sound decisions. So our trauma may compel us to take control of situations even when it's morally questionable to do so. And our monotropic attention tunnel may make us unable to grasp the morality involved entirely. Some autistic people don't even understand that there is any separation between us and other people. Some may now be wondering how our excessively intense experience of empathy could possibly make room for the cruel and uncaring attitude associated with narcissism. Firstly, that's not a universal autistic experience, but for the purposes of this video, that would be due to autistic overwhelm, shutdown, and struggles with cognitive empathy. It's easier to turn off the empathy than it is to turn off autism. If we feel like our overwhelming empathy interferes with the control we need to feel safe, our minds will protect us by shutting that system down. For instance, many holistic people don't think we have empathy unless we confess to their shitty bullshit interpretations of things we do. Such people expect us to admit that we don't care, that we acted selfishly, etc. So we learn empathy requires allowing people to be awful to us. So it becomes the enemy of our safety. And if needed, our rational minds can form arguments that dismiss it. We may have thoughts like, well, they don't care about me, or it makes no sense for them to be this upset, or I would care if they weren't so fucking irrational. Everyone who treats people shitty has an internal dialogue like that. So in summary, if we don't feel like we have the control over our lives that we need to function, Our life experiences have taught us that others cannot be trusted to respect our needs by their own volition. Our monotropic attention tunnel interferes with our perception of boundaries, and our rigidity and strong sense of justice leave us uncompromising about the belief that we are owed. Then it follows that our minds might rationalize treating other people with entitled, narcissistic behavior. This is not our fault. A fundamental truth of human mental health is safety first. Until we feel safe, all other concerns, including morality, go right out the window. But that doesn't mean it's okay to hold anyone's autism against them. Take meltdowns, for instance. As a community, we've already embraced not judging ourselves for experiencing them. We understand autistic people don't have meltdowns. Distressed autistic people have meltdowns. It's a natural chemical reaction between an autistic brain and shit that sucks for an autistic brain. So similarly, if an autistic person exhibits an autistic flavor of narcissism, that's not a reflection of autism. It's a reflection of autism under certain conditions. Let's not forget that hydrogen can produce a catastrophic explosion or a cool glass of water. No one would say, fuck hydration, look at the Hindenburg. If we want to check ourselves for legit narcissism, we can begin by observing our own motives. For instance, if we're redirecting a conversation to ourselves, why are we doing that? Do we think we're more interesting than the other person? Do we want them to think so too? If so, maybe narcissism. On the other hand, we may be trying to relate to their experience through sharing a relevant personal story or perspective, a very autistic thing to do. Or if we're struggling to work in a team, is it because we have no interest in taking in other people's ideas? Do we think ours are superior and the only reason the others reject them is because they're idiots? Are we steamrolling over the others because we feel entitled to do so? That could be narcissistic. But not if we're just having difficulty comprehending the overwhelming cacophony of everyone's varying contributions. It's very autistic for us to hang on to our own ideas because we understand them completely, and therefore feel more confident about implementing them. What it really boils down to is, do we give a shit about how other people feel? Does it matter to us whether or not what we do makes them feel bad? The core belief within an empathetic mind is, I don't like pain, so I don't want to live in a painful world, so I won't contribute to one. Which is basically a more logical, autistic-friendly translation of treat others the way you want to be treated. If we want to live in a world where we are heard, it rationally follows that we would prioritize making others feel heard. The world is a collaborative project. But the narcissistic perspective doesn't see other people as collaborators, it sees them as competition. If the other person is heard, then we are not. If the other person is cared for, we are not. So we end up only caring about others' feelings if it's about how they feel about us. We think we can do whatever we want, and however other people feel about it is their problem. Because that's how we believe the rest of the world is treating us. Because trauma. We believe we are on our own and we are owed. That is what narcissism looks like. That said, it takes our own introspection and self-awareness to unpack this stuff. So if someone accuses us of being narcissistic, we have to be careful how much we take that seriously. We shouldn't let anyone with a flimsy understanding of autism who won't listen to our side have influence over our image of ourselves. Besides, people drop the word carelessly, so it's overused. Anytime anyone wants to give themselves permission to not give a fuck about someone, they cry narcissist. Honestly, a narcissistic person is more likely to dismiss another human's emotions by accusing them of narcissism. Watch out for anybody who calls everybody a narcissist, that's all I'm saying. Despite all the ego-stroking narratives to the contrary, there's a pretty clear pipeline. Dismissing all suggestions of overlap between the two as ableism or toxicity cuts us off from awareness that may be pivotal to our growth and healing. We are all accountable for the consequences of engaging with others in a narcissistic manner, regardless of neurotype. In fact, clinging to an excuse to avoid accountability is textbook narcissistic behavior. So looking at it that way, if we truly want to counter the assumption that autistic people are inherently narcissistic, holding ourselves accountable is a sensible way to go about that. Narcissism has become the mental health boogeyman. We refuse to forgive it in others and we refuse to see it in ourselves. It must, at all costs, remain the other guy. Sometimes I don't know what the hell the neurodivergent internet expects us to do with narcissistic people. Shoot them into space? Banish them to the godless shadow realm from whence they came? If we don't stop making it a cardinal sin to have flaws, no one is going to be self-aware about theirs. The potential for narcissism lurks inside every single one of us, but we can't do shit about that if we refuse to look at it. If we were speeding down a dirt road headed straight for a tree, probably not a great idea to turn our eyes away. I absolutely understand sometimes things are too painful to look at. That's why I have trigger warnings. But we don't want to pass the pain we don't want to feel to other people. If we want to reduce the amount of abuse, hate, and trauma in this world, we have to let the pieces that live inside us die there. And somehow we're going to have to find a way to accept that narcissistic people are valid members of our fucked up human family. And they're going to treat people however they decide to treat people, and there ain't a damn thing in the world we can do about it. What we can do is decide how we're going to treat people and how we're going to allow people to treat us. Maybe it's time to de-emphasize the narcissists or the devil conversations and instead boost some boundary-setting conversations. The intense desire to vilify and exile narcissistic people comes from a place of feeling we're powerless against them if we don't. And without solid boundaries, we are. Boundaries are a profoundly cognitively challenging concept for many autistic people. We aren't likely to intuitively form them because we socialize manually. We need our boundaries to be firm, tangible, and consciously defined for them to exist at all. That is the pursuit that is worthy of our attention right now. If we focus our attention on giving narcissistic people all the blame, we also give them all the power. They invade our space before we can stop them because we don't know where the line is between our needs and theirs. And neither do they. We aren't a different species, and our insistence that we are comes from the actual culprit we should be side-eyeing: shame. We can't look at issues we're ashamed of, and we can't address issues we can't look at. As long as this community continues to bury narcissism this fervently in this pit of shame, we'll avoid what we're actually afraid to find shame for: autism. So many of us have hated ourselves and felt hated by others for so long we can't permit any ideas that could justify hating us. But the thought doesn't even cross our minds that no ideas could justify hating us because hate itself is unjustifiable. Instead of insisting, people shouldn't hate me because I'm not narcissistic, what if we thought people shouldn't hate in general? As long as we believe it's possible for any type of person to deserve hate, we'll always be afraid it could be us. It can't be us. It will never be us. Besides, it's not really the people we hate, it's their behavior and how it affects us. It would be much more productive for us to learn to be loyal to ourselves, honor our own boundaries, and not tolerate people in our lives who don't. And while we can't make anyone change their behavior, and we can't tolerate everyone's behavior, there's always a worthy human being underneath. We don't need to hate narcissistic people to give ourselves permission to disobey their narcissistic demands and avoid getting swept up in their narcissistic tricks. And if the autistic community includes some entitled dipshits that we want to stay the fuck away from, that's okay. Autism doesn't need to be completely devoid of toxicity for us to represent ourselves with pride. And if anyone out there is genuinely concerned that they might be narcissistic, I promise that admitting that does not require opting out of your right to human compassion. In fact, achieving self-awareness under the weight of that much resistance is an accomplishment that I commend you for. If you're ready to face the way you're treating people, there are people out there who will have the capacity and firm enough boundaries to be patient with you. Just stay the fuck away from people who don't. Please and thank you. There is an undeniable correlation between the history of evil in this world and ideologies that encourage degrading one group of people to elevate another. This anti-narcissist crusade is no different. We're just being more discerning about who we can marginalize while still feeling morally upstanding. Traumatized people who have developed narcissistic coping strategies are the world's easiest targets. After all, who would stand up for people with a personality type that is defined by its lack of regard for other people? I can, and I am. I was raised by a parent who was both narcissistic and autistic. I assure you it was not just autism. She talked about being better than other people all the time, was obsessed with status and hierarchy. And I assure you it was not just narcissism. She was hypersensitive to colors and smells and had what she called transition issues when she moved from one activity to another. My upbringing was riddled with abuse and neglect. By day, I was rejected by a world that didn't understand my neurodivergence, and by night I was rejected by a mother who didn't know how to love offspring that reflected back to her everything she hated about herself. I was love-starved and therefore grew into adulthood feeling owed. I demanded from others what was taken from me. Recognizing that I was becoming my mother allowed me to see how a person becomes someone like my mother. She was coping with the same suffering I was. And if I hadn't found compassion for her, I couldn't have found compassion for myself, and there would be a card-carrying narcissist sitting in front of you today. I still care about my mother's feelings. The difference is I don't feel responsible for them anymore. My compassion allowed me to love myself enough to establish and affirm my boundaries. Hurt people, and I do what I do here because I want to intervene in between. And the key to that intervention is self-awareness and self-acceptance, both of which are the polar opposites of avoidance and denial. Being self-aware about how my autism affects the way I process my reality doesn't just show me problems, it shows me solutions. And as understanding and self-acceptance increase, fear and shame decrease. Not to mention, I think it's an honor to see the world from this vantage point. I love that I look at common things in uncommon ways. I love that my discomfort with dishonesty sustains my impeccable integrity, and I love the intensity to which I can love things. So the mere suggestion that autistic assholes exist is not a fucking threat to me. And I hope, if not now, then hopefully someday, it isn't a threat to you either. If you're enjoying my content, please do consider following my other social media accounts at lindsaymakesvideos.com.